Hello again, economics students. Now that we know that the value of the Australian dollar is determined by demand and supply in the foreign exchange market, which occurs all over the world, let's think about what would actually cause an increase or a decrease in demand, or an increase or a decrease in supply, and therefore an appreciation or a depreciation of the Australian dollar. Now, VCAR have given us some very specific factors, but first let's just go through the mechanics of demand and supply, because it's a little bit tricky to think about what would actually cause demand or what impacts demand. Now, I've got a little trick for thinking about what impacts demand and what changes demand, increases or decreases it. And that trick is that any time money comes into Australia from another country, we're going to assume that it comes into Australia in a foreign currency. So maybe it's a Japanese yen, maybe it's the Chinese yuan, maybe it's the US dollar. Now, whenever these currencies come into Australia, you and I both know that you can't walk down the street to 7-Eleven and hand over some Japanese yen to buy a Slurpee. So what happens is they must be exchanged. Now, it doesn't actually matter who exchanges them, but they get exchanged. So if you had Japanese yen and you wanted to spend it in Australia, what would you do? Well, you would sell the yen and you would sell the yen to buy Australian dollars. So whenever there is a buying of Australian dollars, we're always going to think of demand, because demand comes from buying, from purchasing. It's just that in this case, it's purchasing currency. Okay, so whenever money comes into Australia, that impacts the demand for Australian dollars, because we sell the foreign currency and buy Australian dollars so that we can actually transact in Australia. So the trick then becomes, well, what kind of transactions would actually lead to, or what kind of scenarios would actually lead to money coming into Australia? Well, the first one here is exports. So let's take a common example. We sell some iron ore overseas to China, iron ore, and we receive money in US dollars in this case. Those US dollars come into Australia. Well, and we're going to assume that they're always exchanged. They're not always, but we're going to assume that they're always exchanged. So whether it's the Chinese company or it's the Australian mining company, they're going to sell the US dollars and they're going to buy Australian dollars because that company wants Australian dollars. So if there's an increase in exports, that means there's an increase in money coming into Australia, which increases demand. Now, another example would be if a foreign country or a foreign business or whoever was to invest into Australia, they would lend us the money in a different currency. We would sell that currency and we would buy Australian dollars, which would create demand or would increase demand. Finally, if a foreign country or foreign institution was to lend money to Australia, again, that would come in and that would increase demand. So whenever money comes into Australia, we're thinking demand side. And I want you to do this in the next video when we go through each factor. And whenever you're trying to ascertain what happens to the value of the Australian dollar or the exchange rate, you've got to think, is this money coming into Australia and impacting demand, or is it leaving Australia and impacting supply? How good was that transition? So to think about the other side of the market, the supply, whenever money leaves Australia, Australian dollars leaving Australia, we're always going to assume, it's a bit simplified, but we're always going to assume that Australian dollars leave Australia. Well, you and I both know that if you rock up to Singapore, you can't spend Australian dollars in the street. So what do you do with your Australian dollars? Well, you sell it or you swap it for Singapore dollars, sorry. So you sell the Australian dollars, which is a supply. Yeah, whenever you sell something, that we think of that as the supply side of a market. So what are the factors that would cause money to leave Australia? Well, whenever we purchase imports. So if you purchase something from overseas on Amazon, your Australian dollar, again, doesn't matter who exchanges it, but the AUD must get swapped or sold for whatever currency you're buying the product in. So purchasing imports. Another one would be if Australians invest overseas, you buy shares on a foreign stock exchange, that increases the supply of Australian dollars. You sell the AUD. If we are making dividend payments overseas to foreign investors or interest repayments on our debt, all of those things will impact supply. The trick then becomes, does it increase supply or decrease supply? And therefore, appreciate or depreciate the dollar. So hopefully that helps us to understand what would cause an increase, or at least what impacts demand and supply. And as I said at the start, therefore, increase or decrease the value of the dollar. In the next video, we'll go through the specific factors that VCAR has given us. Bye for now.